Hello everyone, I'm Maxime, product manager at OVHcloud, and I'm very happy to be with you and to be your host today. We're gonna have this presentation with my colleague Steven, who is the senior engineering manager at OVHcloud. And during this session, we're gonna discuss the current state of the infrastructure and platform open source ecosystem. We're gonna discuss how it evolved during the very last years. And we're gonna, more importantly, discuss how we OVHcloud, but also you as infrastructure users and project maintainers can help this ecosystem thrive and guarantee more freedom and more data sovereignty for your projects. Before going into the actual content of this panel discussion, I'm gonna let each of our great panelists introduce themselves. Michael, you work at VMware. Can you explain us a bit your role and your position at VMware and what open source project you work with or play a part into?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Michael. I'm a director of product management at VMware, and I'm responsible for a lot of our open source investments and ecosystem. I am one of the maintainers for Harbor, an open source registry for Kubernetes that is a graduated project in CNCF. I am a maintainer for Contour, an ingress controller in Kubernetes that is an incubating project in CNCF. And I'm also the project lead for Velero, the backup and recovery tool for Kubernetes, for Sonovui, the inspection tool that helps validate CNCF conformance for Kubernetes, and a few other open source tools. I'm also a chair in the Kubernetes community, and I lead the Windows effort and on all the work around Windows containers in Kubernetes. Thank you.
That's a lot of projects, but definitely all of them are really interesting. Thierry, on your side, you've been with the Openstack Foundation for years. You are currently as a VP of Engineering on Openstack. Can you explain us the key project you worked on and you currently focus on?
Sure. So my name is Thierry Carrez. I work for the Openstack Foundation as the Vice President of Engineering there. That's mostly around making sure that the open source projects that we support and sustain are in good health and operate under good open source practices. I've also been directly involved with the OpenStack project more directly as release manager for the project for a very long time, and was elected to the OpenStack technical committee as well. And before that, I worked for Canonical on Ubuntu server. So it's been a while since I've been involved in open source infrastructure.
Perfect. We are also very lucky to have Benjamin Jean with us. Benjamin, you are the president of Ionocube, but you are also having multiple roles in different open source initiatives. Can you share with us what you focus today?
Yes, of course. Hi everybody. I'm Benjamin Jean. I am an IP law lawyer, intellectual property lawyer, specialized on open source and open data matters. I'm the founder and president of Ionocube, which is an expert independent and consulting firm specialized on such topics. And we do operate in France and beyond to help, I would say, private and public sector organization to work together through open source or open data, all of them, these models. So I am also involved in several open source projects and several open source NGOs in France and beyond in order to, I would say, help people in each sector like mobility, energy, space, all of this industry to try to find a way to work together thanks to open source and open source matters.
Perfect. Thierry, OpenStack is now more than 10 years old. You've been part of it from the start. Can you share with us how you consider that open source and especially the OpenStack community has evolved during those 10 years?
Right. When OpenStack was started 10 years ago, it was really focused as a single software project, providing an open source alternative to the giants of the time, like VMware for private cloud and Amazon Web Services for public clouds. And it was a very ambitious goal. And back then, there weren't that many examples of open source being used to provide infrastructure. But in the last 10 years, the OpenStack ecosystem and beyond that, open source has evolved a lot. Today, we see a lot more adoption of open source. There is this study showing that the percentage of companies using open source evolved from 37% in 2010 to 99% in 2020. So we see open source being used in a lot of new use cases like cloud infrastructure, combining solutions like OpenStack and Kubernetes, but also edge computing, machine learning, telecommunications, modern factories everywhere. And we see also open source as a key enabler of data sovereignty by giving access to those technologies to everyone. And we see that people combine open source infrastructure pieces to build those systems, which really points to a need for more integration between technical solutions, more integrated testing, more collaboration between communities that produce those pieces. And so we realized that our mission goes way beyond producing a single piece of software like OpenStack. It goes beyond just producing OpenStack and is more about supporting the creation and operation of open infrastructure solutions.
Interesting. Ourselves at OVHcloud have been using OpenStack for years. We've been then exposing the OpenStack API. That way we guarantee total reversibility for our customers using our public cloud solutions. We've been doing that for more than 5 years now. We are also infrastructure donor. We are a sponsor of the foundation. But can we share with us also what are the future challenges that you see for OpenStack and the other project from the foundations?
Yes. So when OpenStack started, it attracted lots of vendors who brought in lots of contributors. And back then, we did not have that many users. A lot of development was done to turn this very young software into the rock-solid solution that it is today. But today, OpenStack is much more stable, and we really have a lot of users. But we also have less vendors, as the only ones who managed to build a successful business model around OpenStack are still around. And so less vendors means less contributors. And with the software being much more stable, there is less pressure to contribute. So our challenge today is really to survive that phase of stability and keep enough contributors around to maintain the high quality that we have reached. So with less vendors and more users, we need those users to step up and help maintain it. And it's not just the project, also the project infrastructure itself. Because to go beyond the limits of other tools, we built a really advanced project infrastructure, openly operated, open source. And we're very lucky that companies like OVH donate significant computing resources to make it work. But it's really hard to find help to run it those days. So I would say that that's the most significant challenge for OpenStack and its ecosystem in 2020.
Really interesting. Michael, on your way, as you explained earlier, you are a lead on multiple open source projects initiated by VMware. Can you explain when and why VMware decided to adopt open source for a large part of the Tanzu ecosystem? Can you decide how you choose that a given project will remain proprietary or which one will be open source?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think, like Thierry mentioned earlier, one of the most important things from a community and market and industry is that there's a significant adoption of open source. More companies are willing to adopt open source either as a solution or a component of a solution, so an infrastructure building block. So, from us, from a VMware standpoint, we see engaging with the open source community as a great and valuable way to increase our diversity, increase the number of contributors that bring a different perspective to open source. That's very valuable. You have developers and engineers from different technical areas, from different industries that come and work with you to build a solution. So that becomes very strategic for us. Then The second thing, and this is very, very important, is that the entire community and the industry gets to align on a single project or a product. By basically having everybody operate on open source, you're building consensus, you're building a common set of goals, a common set of infrastructure. So you all collaborate, whether you're competitors or peers, you all collaborate and you find that common ground on building a solution. That creates a best of breed solution. That means, like, for example, Kubernetes, everybody, the entire industry aligned over a single solution. So what does that make it? It makes it a better product. Everybody gets to work on it, constructively build that set of technology that becomes a dependency layer for everybody. So now everybody builds on top of it and you start creating value added on top. In some ways, by collaborating on open source, you make it a commodity. You make it the infrastructure everybody gets to build on top of. And then you have every company from public cloud providers to companies basically creating their own distributions on top of it and creating kind of their own special sauce. But at a high level, we see open source as an accelerator to innovation. It's very simple. Lots of people get to work on complex problems, solve them faster by building more capable platforms. So that's really the big reason why VMware is doing it. You know, when do we make the decision on when there's something should remain open source or proprietary? We always have the idea to lead with open source. So on new projects where we see value in the community, we want to lead with open source. We want to build consensus. We want to build the use cases. We want to bring the different perspectives in and let those projects grow as open source. And if there are certain proprietary components to them, then we'll evaluate that in our proprietary distributions.
And if we only consider the open source parts of the Tanzu ecosystem, we can see that some of them are actually part of the CNCF project. You mentioned them earlier, while some other remain in the VMware Tanzu GitHub repo. Can you also explain why you choose to give some project to the CNCF, and what is your experience with the management of those CNCF projects?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. I think that in order for a project to get to the CNCF and be accepted at sandbox, incubation, or graduation, it has to meet certain criteria. And it's not just about the project being a great project or solving a real problem, because we have a lot of projects like that, but it's about demonstrating big adoption from users and customers, an open governance model, having a strong commitment to community, and more importantly, having diversity from maintainers, so a single company doesn't have control and ownership of these projects. So if you kind of think of a project in its evolution when it starts, if, for example, VMware is the one that started that project, we're funding it with the most of the engineering resources. Over time, as a project becomes successful, as we have more and more contributors come and join the project, then you start seeing maintainers from other companies. The point in time when you can donate the project to the CNCF is not only having a feature maturity and having that strong commitment to community, but actually having that diversity of maintainers. So a single company doesn't own all the keys to the project, where you can have, for example, VMware have a certain set of maintainers, but 2 or 3 other companies also have maintainers into the project, so that you can kind of create a common governance that everybody can operate on. That's when you're ready to go to the CNCF and kind of open up, so that you, by having a governance under a standards body, then you're encouraging more and more contributors and more companies to come and invest in your software.
Perfect.
So, hi, Benjamin. You introduce Ionocube, and then your coaching companies driving or helping drive their open source strategies. What kind of challenges are they facing, and which kind of solution does exist today for solve these challenges?
Yeah, I would say it depends of each organization, and maybe it's mainly a question of maturity. At first, the question is generally to understand how to manage open source software, manage open source licenses within their own products and organization. And this moment, the discussion is focused on compliance matters regarding open source license, contributor agreements, all those contracts you have to agree to when you're doing open source software, developing open source software or reusing open source software. I would say introducing an open source policy within their organization is a way for them to focus on what is their real on added value. So it's not so easy for them, but it's a way to become more agile, to be more innovative and resilient. And it's also a question of culture, because developers now are looking for projects which have, I would say, real impact worldwide. So open source is for them a way to attract new talented engineers. Say second level, when they understood how open source works and they figured out how they can gain or benefit from open source, they want to contribute to open source projects, they want to start new open source projects. And because for them, it's a way of becoming more innovative, and they want us to help them to foster and secure collaboration with other organizations. So in this, I would say, when they're asking for it, it's a question of defining a right strategy based on what their own practices, what they're doing in this time regarding intellectual property, I would say. And for them, what might be difficult is to find the right manners to articulate their will to do open source, to contribute to open source projects, and their need to secure their intellectual property rights or to secure their development strategy. So in this moment, it's depending on what is their industrial sector. It's sometimes very difficult for them to find the right way to articulate both open source strategy and other, we say, intellectual property rights strategy like patents. All of their other use of intellectual property they might want in their own organization. So historically, when we are thinking about patents, historically software patents are considered as a threat, something bad, something which can't be, I would say, something which is opposite to open source. And for some players which want to do both open source in order to contribute with other organizations worldwide and to have some tools to defend themselves, when other people are doing some kind of software patent strategy against them. So on those topics, they need to think about how they can find the right way to combine all of this strategy and all of these needs in just one organization.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I think that Ionocube and OVH has worked together lately. So which kind of solution has been found regarding OVH and its community, regarding different open source projects to protect innovation and contributions also?
So regarding OVHcloud, it's quite interesting because it's typically an organization which are used to develop open source software and to contribute to. So there's a real will to continue to do open source, and in the same time, there is a need for being protected against software patent trolls. So what was done is first to be sure that every open source licenses used by OVH include a patent grant within. So when OVH is doing open source, they can say, even if we are in another side using open source software, when we are doing open source, it is full open source. So I think it was the first need to be coherent in its open source strategy. And on another hand, there is a need to just to affirm to formalize that OVH can protect or can contribute to a more protected world collaboration in its field, and that's in this moment we try to find a way OVH can just have a patent grant and a patent pledge, which just explain why sometimes some software patents owned by OVH might be useful for the community, because OVH will never use it against the community, but will use their own IP rights in order to protect the community in OVH field.
Well, thank you, Benjamin. And I have the pleasure to announce that we are joining the Open Innovation Network alongside with creating a patent pledge so that we can protect our innovation and both our community and different open source projects. But we will communicate more on this later on our blog. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Benjamin, Michael, but also Thierry, all of you have worked with companies of different sizes. We've worked with teams that have different maturities in different geographies. Do you consider that open source have now convinced the totality of the IT ecosystem, or do you see some having embraced it in a more efficient way than others? Maybe Thierry?
Sure. I feel like open source is really ubiquitous today. Like I said earlier, 99% of companies are estimated to be using it this year. So, but that number obviously hides a variety of cases. There are those that just use it on the periphery as a way to pick random software and control cost. There is those who build it to really boost their innovation and try to get a competitive edge on their on other companies. And there are those who build a complete business model around it. And the trick, I guess, for open source today is that those business models often damage open source sustainability. Like, for example, providing open source software as a service in the cloud is inserting a layer between the consumers and the producers of the software. And we need to be very careful with that, because if left unchecked, it can really disconnect the projects from their natural contributor base. And so same problem with the organizations trying to create non-compete licenses and trying to paint them as open source, like trying to restrict usage of open source to a single company. And that's also is very destructive to open source. So yes, there is a lot of variety in the way companies use open source, but lately we've seen new developments that we need to, as open source developers and the open source community in general, we need to be very careful with how this is developing.
Michael, do you have a specific point of view of this subject? Companies embracing differently open source?
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with a lot of the things that Thierry mentioned. I want to add 2 points. I think that today the market and customers and users, they're making a choice in their software in a lot of ways based on open source. And one of the biggest reasons behind that is avoiding vendor lock-in. By utilizing a single open source solution as the base of all the software that they're using, or as the actual software itself, they're essentially saying that I'm going to basically build my infrastructure, build my solutions on top of a common programming model, on top of a common solution, that whether I get it from vendor A or vendor B or completely open source, it's going to be the same. So I avoid the vendor lock-in. The second part, a key thing behind open source is that you also need to have the companies that are going to be offering support for open source. I think one of the still big issues around open source is that, yes, it's a great solution, a lot of features, a lot of contribution coming out there. But what happens if I have a critical security vulnerability that happens? Or what happens if I have a critical severity 0 issue that is a production impacting issue? Who's going to help me? And that's when customers and users are looking to vendors that are commercializing some of this open source for support so that it can help them sleep better at night in case something like a disaster happens.
Perfect. Benjamin, do you see a difference in smaller versus larger customers? Do they question differ? What are the different challenges depending on maybe the maturity also of the developer teams?
I would say regarding big players and including digital, but not only digital players, open source is not the question anymore. Every of them are doing a lot of open source projects, and in this field, open source is already the principle. But where there is some interesting need today is regarding final users. How can they contribute to open source project? How can they sustain projects they are using? And where there is a lot of work to do is for maintainers. Maintainers, depending on each project, maintainers are sometimes individual or some very small companies which need to find a way to have an open source to maintain the I would say openness of their project. At the same time, they find a way to fund themselves, to gain money from the exploitation or commercialization of the open source project. And I think in this, for them, for maintainers, there is still some question we need to answer to be sure open source can be sustainable for each people involved on these projects.
We just say that the vast majority of companies now use open source software. Michael and Thierry, I'm pretty sure that especially the people looking at this session are wanting to also get involved into the software that we use to expose infrastructure and platform services. What would be your advice for a first contribution to the project that you manage? Maybe Michael first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, first of all, we welcome all contributors of all levels, whether they have familiarity with our projects or not. The most important thing is start participating in the community meetings, start attending presentations, start getting familiar with the project first. Then over time, start using the project. That's going to be a huge way to start contributing is you could identify documentation bugs or issues with the software, start filing those. It's kind of the entry level to the community is by actually contributing by a way of improving the software, whether that's documentation or whether that's source code. And then over time, start reviewing PRs and start seeing what are the different things that the more senior members of the project are commenting. What are they looking for? How are they protecting key elements of the project, whether that's software design or applying certain principles or keeping with the tenets of the project? What is it that we're trying to achieve with a certain project? So start seeing that and understanding. And then over time, as a contributor, you'll be ready to create your own PRs and then seek feedback from the community. Maybe get a mentor that could help you in that process. And I think that's kind of the journey that someone needs to follow. So start small, be a part of the community, listen first, pay attention, see how the project is run, and over time start contributing in your own way and find your own stamp of how to make an impact into the project.
Thierry, as you just said earlier, OpenStack is now very stable and mature. What kind of contribution would help such a project today?
I would say that contribution, I agree with everything that Michael just said, but contribution like getting involved in an open source project is a ladder with many steps. And sometimes directly contributing a code or documentation is not the first one. For me, the very first step is to be public about using it. It's a very small step for the companies that use the software, but it really makes a very big difference for the open source projects, knowing where their software is used and at which scale, etc. The second step would be to be willing to share your experience running it, like submitting presentations at events or joining discussions in open discussions on the mailing lists or on the various communication channels you have. Then the third step is to substantially contribute back. Like for all projects that are openly developed, like Michael said, we take all contributions of all forms and everyone is welcome to contribute. So it can be monetary contributions, donating money to the organizations that sustain those projects. It can be community contributions like running local events, or project contributions like contributing bug fixes or improvements or documentation. And then the final step is to deeply engage in the community by funding one or more people to work on the project full time and being able to lead it, because you need leaders in every community. And for all those steps, you will find that you get more out of your engagement than you put in. It makes business sense to contribute. If you make the investment to use a technology, actively engaging in the community producing it will make you more efficient. It will allow you to anticipate changes. It will help you make sure that the software grows the features that you as a company will need tomorrow. So you will get more out of the project than what you put in. So you should engage step by step, but engage more.
Perfect.
And I want to add one more thing. As a contributor, if you're going to an open source project that's very highly visible, used by many companies, it would improve someone's career. You get to put in your resume a project that's thousands of users and millions of users are using, and it's going to be a sought after technology. So being a key contributor to those technologies is only going to improve someone's career. So if you're looking into that and you're interested in committing to open source and participating, please, it's a great career booster.
I'm also interested, as 2020 was a very special year. If each of you have a specific open source news that surprised you this year, or that you consider is worth watching the impact in the long term, outside of your specific project, of course, can you share that with the community? Maybe Thierry?
Yes, there is a lot of discussion happening right now on the evolution of open source, like how to make open source more sustainable, but also how to make open source more ethical. And it is very difficult to drive those goals without breaking what made open source successful. So it's really a discussion that is worth watching, and it will be very interesting to see how that discussion evolves in the coming year.
Benjamin, on your side, any event or new project that you consider will make a change?
I think there is today a very interesting trend with the convergence between open science and open source, because more and more researchers are doing open source, are doing a software project or are using software in order to do science. And what they are doing is producing open source software more and more. And the way they are doing it is changing the way science is working. So it's quite interesting in France, in Europe, and I would say internationally, to just to see how it will evolve in the next years.
Michael, on your side, did you see something interesting in that year that changed a bit the panorama in the open source world?
Yeah, I think that the evolution of 5G and Edge is going to play a critical role in open source. Telecom and telco have not been a primary at the primary forefront of open source lately, and I think with the evolution of more devices having compute power and internet accessible in the future, we're going to see a new wave of open source software that's going to be catering to those use cases and scenarios. So I look very forward to seeing how the industry kind of collaborates and joins each other towards this endeavor.
Perfect. all this was really interesting. I hope everyone learned a lot of things today. Basically, I think the best way to conclude this presentation is to invite everyone to participate, especially in the project that we mentioned. For example, the Arbor project that OVHcloud participates into and that Michael leads. Of course, the different project within the OpenStack ecosystem. And I would also invite you, if you've got the chance to develop major software, to maybe have a look at what and how Ionocube can help you define your open source strategy around new and existing software. Thanks a lot for your attention, and we are just back in a few seconds for the Q&A.